The Book of Tobit. The Book of Tobit is a Jewish narrative set among Israelite exiles living in Assyria. It appears in Catholic and Orthodox Old Testaments, but is usually excluded from Protestant Bibles, which is why it is labeled Deuterocanonical, meaning accepted later into the canon by some Christian traditions. The story follows Tobit, a righteous Israelite who remains faithful to the law of Moses while living in Nineveh. He gives alms, buries murdered Israelites, and practices mercy even when it brings danger. After one burial, Tobit becomes blind when bird droppings fall into his eyes. His blindness functions as a crisis that tests his faith rather than a punishment. At the same time, in the city of Ecbatana, a woman named Sarah suffers repeated tragedy. Each of her 7 husbands dies on the wedding night, killed by a demon named Asmodeus. Sarah faces accusations, despair, and shame, and she prays to God for help. Tobit also prays for relief from suffering. The text emphasizes that God hears both prayers and responds by sending the angel Raphael. Raphael appears disguised as a man and guides Tobit's son, Tobias, on a journey to recover money stored with a relative. Along the way, Tobias catches a large fish from the Tigris River. Raphael instructs him to keep the heart, liver, and gall, explaining that these will serve specific purposes. The heart and liver will drive away the demon afflicting Sarah, and the gall will treat Tobit's blindness. These details reflect ancient medicinal and exorcistic practices presented as divinely guided. Tobias marries Sarah and follows Raphael's instructions by burning the fish organs and praying with her before consummation. The demon is driven away, and the couple returns to Nineveh. Tobias then applies the fish's gall to Tobit's eyes, removing a white film and restoring his sight. After the healings and protections are complete, Raphael reveals that he is one of 7 angels who stand before God. He explains that he was sent to test, guide, and heal, and he instructs the family to continue living righteously. Books of the Maccabees. Books of the Maccabees appear in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles as historical accounts of Jewish resistance against foreign rule in the 2nd century BCE. These books document the events surrounding the Maccabean revolt, when Jewish groups fought against the Seleucid Empire, which attempted to suppress Jewish religious practices. Seleucid refers to the Hellenistic Greek kingdom that ruled parts of the Middle East after the empire of Alexander the Great fractured. The revolt emerged after the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes outlawed core Jewish practices, such as circumcision and Sabbath observance, and desecrated the Jerusalem temple by installing pagan worship. First, Maccabees provides a chronological, battlefield-focused narrative. It describes how a priest named Mattathias and his sons, especially Judas Maccabeus, led an armed uprising, reclaimed the temple, and restored traditional worship. This restoration is the historical foundation for the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, which commemorates the rededication of the temple. The book emphasizes military strategy, political alliances, and national identity rather than miracles or theological commentary. Its style resembles classical historical writing, with attention to dates, rulers, and successive campaigns. 2nd Maccabees is not a sequel, but a parallel account that covers some of the same events with a different purpose. It summarizes a larger, now lost 5-volume work and focuses on religious meaning rather than military detail. It includes narratives of martyrdom, such as the account of a mother and her 7 sons who refused to eat pork, an act that was used by the Seleucid regime to force Jews to abandon their laws. The book presents their deaths as acts of faithfulness and introduces themes such as resurrection of the dead, divine justice, and God's intervention in history. These theological ideas influenced later Jewish and Christian thought. 3rd Maccabees is unrelated to the revolt despite its title. Instead, it describes a crisis under King Ptolemy IV in Egypt, where Jews face attempts at forced assimilation and persecution. The narrative uses dramatic storytelling to depict how God protects the Jewish community from mass execution. The themes mirror the larger pattern found in other Deuterocanonical writings. The faithful face oppression, pray, and experience deliverance through divine action. 4th Maccabees, included in some Eastern Christian traditions, is a philosophical reflection rather than a historical record. It argues that reason, understood as disciplined obedience to God's law, can master emotions and desire. It uses examples from 2nd Maccabees, especially the martyrdom stories, to support this claim. The book serves as a bridge between Jewish religious ethics and Greek philosophical concepts. Book of Judith. The Book of Judith is a Jewish narrative set during a period of foreign domination, though its historical details are intentionally blended and rearranged. Because of this, the book functions as theological storytelling rather than strict chronology. It appears in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles and is absent from most Protestant canons. The narrative introduces Nebuchadnezzar as a ruler of Assyria instead of Babylon, which signals that the book is using a composite villain to represent oppressive empires in general, rather than describing a specific historical moment. The story centers on Judith, a widowed Jewish woman living in the town of Bethulia. An Assyrian general named Holofernes leads a massive military campaign to force submission from surrounding nations. When Bethulia is besieged and its water supply is cut off, the leaders consider surrender. Judith rebukes them for losing faith and insists that God can deliver the people, but she also takes practical action. She prepares a strategic plan in which she will leave the city, enter the enemy camp, and exploit the assumptions Holofernes and his soldiers make about her. Judith dresses in fine clothing, symbolizing both dignity and deliberate misdirection. She goes to Holofernes' camp, claiming she has inside knowledge that can help him win. The narrative emphasizes how quickly the general becomes captivated by her appearance, revealing his overconfidence and lack of discipline. He invites her to a banquet, intending to seduce her. The text highlights that Judith never violates Jewish dietary laws. She brings her own food to maintain ritual purity, even while inside the enemy camp. During the banquet, Holofernes becomes drunk and collapses. Judith uses his sword to decapitate him, an act that removes the central figure holding the siege together. She and her maid place the head in a bag and return to Bethulia. When the Israelites display Holofernes' head on the city wall, fear spreads through the Assyrian camp. Their army, leaderless and confused, retreats in panic. The story portrays victory as the result of Judith's courage, strategic intelligence, and unwavering trust in God, combined with the enemy's arrogance and moral weakness. Judith's final actions emphasize restoration. She leads the community in worship, and the people praise her as an instrument of divine deliverance. The narrative presents Judith as a model of faithfulness who uses wisdom, bravery, and religious devotion to protect her people during crisis. Wisdom of Solomon. The Wisdom of Solomon is a Jewish work written in Greek, likely in Alexandria, between the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE. It appears in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but is absent from most Protestant canons. The book speaks in the voice of King Solomon as a literary device, allowing the author to teach about wisdom, justice, and God's guidance with recognized authority. Wisdom in this book refers to a divine quality, God's own insight, creativity, and moral order. The author describes wisdom as a holy, active spirit that helps people understand truth and live righteously. A central theme is the contrast between the righteous, who seek wisdom and obey God, and the wicked, who deny God and judge life only by physical existence. The book teaches that the righteous live on with God after death, making it one of the earliest Jewish texts to clearly express belief in an afterlife. The book also interprets Israel's history, especially the Exodus, as examples of how divine wisdom protects the faithful and judges oppressors. It emphasizes that God governs the world with justice and patience, giving people time to turn from wrongdoing. A long section critiques idolatry, defined as worshiping man-made images, arguing that it leads to moral corruption because lifeless objects cannot guide human behavior. Finally, the book teaches that wisdom was present at creation and helped order the universe. This portrayal links divine wisdom with God's creative work and later influenced early Christian ideas about the Logos, or divine Word. Book of Sirach. The Book of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, is a Jewish wisdom book written in Hebrew around the early 2nd century BCE. It appears in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but is excluded from most Protestant canons. Sirach is essentially a comprehensive guide to ethical living, combining practical instruction, moral reflection, and teachings rooted in the Jewish law. It was translated into Greek by the author's grandson, who explains in a preface that the book aims to preserve Jewish wisdom during a period of cultural pressure from surrounding Greek society. The book covers many aspects of daily life: family relationships, speech, work, generosity, friendship, and personal discipline. Sirach emphasizes that wisdom comes from fear of the Lord, meaning reverence, obedience, and moral awareness, not from human achievement. It teaches that wise speech can build integrity, while careless words cause conflict. It also offers guidance about wealth, warning that money can corrupt judgment when not handled with fairness and compassion. Sirach places strong emphasis on honoring parents, maintaining humility, and treating the poor with justice. It stresses that almsgiving atones for sins, reflecting a belief that mercy shown to others shapes one's standing before God. The book also includes practical warnings about anger, gossip, and irresponsible behavior, explaining how each one disrupts community life. A major feature is its praise of Israel's ancestors. The final section, often called the Hymn in Honor of the Fathers, recounts figures like Elijah, Hezekiah, and Simon the high priest, showing how God worked through them to preserve the nation. This historical review reinforces the book's central message. Wisdom is learned by studying God's actions and following the examples of those who lived faithfully. Book of Baruch. The Book of Baruch is a Jewish work linked to Baruch, the scribe and companion of the prophet Jeremiah. It appears in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but is excluded from most Protestant canons. The setting is the Babylonian exile, when many Judeans were taken from Jerusalem after its destruction in 587 BCE. The book presents itself as a collection of prayers, confessions, and teachings sent from Babylon back to Jerusalem as an act of repentance and renewal. The opening chapters focus on national confession. The people acknowledge that their exile resulted from disobedience to God's law, not from political failure. This section explains the exile as a moral consequence. When a nation abandons justice and covenant loyalty, it becomes vulnerable to foreign powers. At the same time, the text stresses that God remains faithful and will restore the people if they return to righteousness. A key emphasis is the value of wisdom and the law. The book contrasts human attempts to find wisdom through power or wealth with the true wisdom found in God's commandments. It teaches that the law itself is a source of life, identity, and protection, and that following it leads to restoration. This theme mirrors teachings found in Deuteronomy and later Jewish writings. The latter portion, sometimes called the Letter of Jeremiah, is a critique of idolatry. It describes the futility of worshiping statues made of wood, metal, or stone. These images must be carried by people, cannot speak, cannot act, and cannot respond. The text uses vivid examples to show that idols depend entirely on human activity, demonstrating that they cannot protect or guide those who rely on them. Additions to Esther. The additions to Esther are extra sections found in the Greek Septuagint version of Esther, but not in the Hebrew text. They appear in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles and expand the story by adding clear references to God, detailed prayers, and prophetic elements that the Hebrew version does not contain. One addition is Mordecai's symbolic dream, which uses imagery of conflict and deliverance to foreshadow Haman's plot against the Jews. The Greek text also includes full versions of royal decrees, first commanding destruction of the Jews, then reversing that order, highlighting how imperial law drives the events. Several editions focus on prayer. Mordecai and Esther both cry out to God for protection, emphasizing the religious dimension of the crisis. The Greek text also expands Esther's approach to the king. She fasts, appears in humble clothing, and nearly collapses when the king initially reacts with anger. God's intervention softens the king's heart, underscoring divine involvement in the outcome. These additions make the story explicitly religious, framing Israel's deliverance as a result of prayer, prophecy, and God's guidance. Additions to Daniel. The additions to Daniel are extra narratives preserved in the Greek Septuagint, but absent from the Hebrew Aramaic version of Daniel. They appear in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles and include three main sections: the Prayer of Azariah, the Song of the Three Young Men, and expanded material surrounding the fiery furnace story. These additions highlight themes of confession, worship, and God's direct intervention. The Prayer of Azariah is placed between the moment the three young men are thrown into the furnace and the description of their rescue. In this prayer, Azariah confesses Israel's sins, explains that exile is a consequence of disobedience, and appeals to God's mercy. The prayer adds theological depth by framing the furnace episode as part of Israel's broader need for repentance. The Song of the Three Young Men follows this prayer. It is a long hymn that praises God for his justice and calls all creation, angels, elements, animals, and people, to bless God. The hymn functions as an expansion of the miracle, showing that the three men not only survive the fire, but worship inside it, turning the furnace into a place of proclamation rather than fear. Another addition describes the furnace itself being overheated and the flames harming the soldiers outside, but not the young men within. An angel is depicted as protecting them, making the divine rescue more explicit than in the Hebrew version. These additions amplify the spiritual message of the story by including confession, praise, and angelic intervention alongside the narrative of deliverance. Story of Susanna. The story of Susanna is an additional narrative attached to Daniel in the Greek tradition. It appears in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles and presents Daniel as a young, wise judge. The story centers on Susanna, a married Jewish woman falsely accused of adultery by two elders who attempted to coerce her into a sexual encounter. Because elders served as judges, Their testimony carried significant authority, and under the law, adultery was punishable by death. Susanna refuses their demands, is accused, and faces execution. Daniel intervenes by questioning the elders separately. When their stories contradict, their false testimony is exposed, and Susanna is vindicated. The narrative emphasizes justice, integrity, and the corruption that arises when authority is misused. Bel and the Dragon. Bel and the Dragon is another addition connected to Daniel. It contains two separate episodes that challenge idol worship in Babylon. In the first, the Babylonian god Bel is said to consume daily offerings. Daniel proves this claim false by spreading ashes on the temple floor. When footprints reveal that priests and their families enter secretly to take the food, the deception collapses. In the second episode, Daniel confronts a living serpent worshipped as a god. He kills it using a mixture of pitch, fat, and hair, demonstrating that it is a creature, not a deity. These stories highlight Daniel's refusal to participate in idolatry and present him as exposing fraud through observation and reasoning. The Prayer of Manasseh. The Prayer of Manasseh is a short penitential prayer attributed to King Manasseh of Judah. In the Hebrew Bible, Manasseh is described as one of the most corrupt kings, associated with idolatry, injustice, and desecration of the temple. Later tradition describes him repenting while imprisoned by the Assyrians. This prayer expresses deep confession, acknowledging guilt, rejecting pride, and appealing to God's mercy. It presents repentance as available even to someone with a history of severe wrongdoing, and reflects the broader biblical theme that genuine humility can restore a broken relationship with God. If you want to explore even further, the story doesn't end with these books. Several other ancient writings were completely left out of every major biblical canon. In this video, we walk through the books that were banned or excluded entirely, and why they disappeared.